The year is 2005, an extremely packed year for video games as we get bangers back to back. Even just within the racing genre, that was the year we see releases like Midnight Club 3, Need for Speed Most Wanted, and Burnout Revenge, just to name a few. Competition was arguably at its peak with each studio bringing out their strongest title at the time to duke it out. For some studios, it also became the busiest year where they would develop and release a lot of titles back to back. And it would be the case for Genki. That year alone, they released Tokyo Xtreme Drift 2 in Japan, the PSP spin-off Street Supremacy, and this weird mecha game. Unbeknownst to many, however, they also released a fourth title that year, one that would try to shake up their usual formula to a more legal side of street racing, a game which never saw the light of day outside of its homeland. This is Genki's attempt at a circuit racer. At its core, the title lends a lot of its mechanics to the latest mainline entry, borrowing a lot of its features while also building up on them and improving them in one way or more, but also having its own flair of originality that would be unseen in any future releases to date. The game itself would be released for the PlayStation 2 on May 26, only a month after Street Supremacy's release in Japan. That's pretty astonishing to say the least, even if they had already worked on a bulk of the content beforehand for both titles. But why is this game suddenly popping off in everyone's recommendations anyways? Well, it's due to the efforts of the fans, especially Mr. Igor right here, who spent months modding, translating most of the important bits of the game. You can check out his channel for the tutorial and more updates, as the game is not 100% translated just yet, with some text still in Japanese such as the player name title alongside the rival crews and their profiles. The game itself begins with a selection of modes like Quest, Versus, and Challenge mode, the last one allowing the player to drive any car on any track. It is essentially the equivalent of an arcade mode, so what we want is Quest mode for the main campaign. As the intro suggests, this game is set as an entirely legal racing scene, taking place in many different close tracks within the Japanese borders, but Genki being Genki has decided to turn the C1 highway loop itself into a massive circuit, effectively turning the old setup of Tokyo Xtreme Racer into something more legitimate. But before we get deeper into the racing, we need to establish ourselves first, with this game's first big turn-up point of garage setup. It's purely cosmetic, so pick whichever you like. And finally, our first starter car selection. We get to pick either new or used, each with their own advantages. But let's look into what's available in the new selection. Here we can see all of the available brands in the game, which only includes Japanese brands. With 5 million CP in hand, everything you can see here is purchasable, but you might want to think it over as the selection is quite varied. On one hand, we have the low-powered boxy vans and K cars, or some of the faster sports cars on the other. If you're not sure, then maybe it's time to check out what the used car dealership has to offer. In this section, you can choose to buy or sell your rides here. For purchasing, the game usually rotates 5 cars in total between one another every day, with the ability to check on the car's visual, mileage, and pre-installed upgrades. Despite that, used cars will generally always be cheaper than the brand new models, which you may think is the superior option, but let's say there's a bit of a surprise waiting for you. After picking your JDM Dreambox, the game immediately throws you into the game's attempt at a license test, a grueling and difficult task many would fail to pass: a lap around Tsukuba. Bruh. Try as you might, you can't really fail this so-called license test. The game will just force you to restart from the pit over and over again. It mainly serves to get players up to speed with the game's handling, simulation mechanics such as oil and water temperature, tire temperatures, and their new ride. Although they really went above and beyond to make you feel really fast with the visual effect. Finishing this, we're given access to the first 3 tracks of the game: Shutoko Outer, Tsukuba, and Suzuka's East section. Back in the garage, there are some more options to access, but let's tackle the core progression first and foremost. As a Genki game, the formula itself hasn't really been changed outside of the methods to achieve them. You're a newcomer to the racing scene, and now you have to beat every single named racer on the list. To shake things up a bit, the way to challenge opponents has been split into several choices you can go for. The first being the usual SP battles you'd normally know from Genki's usual method, a battle between racers with essentially a HP bar. The way this is handled now is by putting you in a track day scenario. You have limited time on the track, each racer is spaced out between each other, and you can challenge them either by pressing the prompt button when near them or by honking at them. This time, however, more power has been given to the player, as you can now chain between 3 rivals to beat back to back, with the rare occasion of starting a 2v1 battle or a 3v1 battle if the rivals are in the same crew, assuming you can catch up to them before the timer runs out, of course, which you can bypass to immediately start the race by honking again. This is actually a pretty cool change from the usual fare in TXR, giving players more freedom and choice of how they want to approach each race, although it also comes at the cost of lessening some of the magic when a surprise team battle is triggered. But just be sure to keep an eye out for your SP bar as it carries over in chained races, alongside the oil and water temperature if you're going all out. Because these events are also considered as official track days, there are no trademark Genki traffic cars allowed anywhere on site. Instead, most of the random track day participants will fill the shoes of both rivals and obstacles during races. Also, they will kick you out of the venue for pulling shenanigans like driving the wrong way. When the timer runs out, it will instantly boot you out of the track unless a race is already queued up. This is generally the best way to earn the usual currency, thanks to the ability to chain multiple rivals while having generally short and rapid races, which also contains a multiplier boost for perfectly clean races, capable of reaching at least 10 million in a single session, so the economy of this game is definitely more on the lenient side. The second option is known as DP battles. This is the most tedious one of the three options, but it's still an option for those who prefer to outstyle the opponents via drift battles. It works in the way of interspear drift zones, where your performance score is tallied. If you spin out, sniff a wall, or go out of the tarmac, the score tally is then collected. Reach the end of a drift zone without doing this, and the game will give you bonus scores based on how many completed zones you can do in a row. Unlike SP battles, however, there is no way to challenge more than one opponent, and you need to do the entire drift zone even after the target score has been achieved. It's kind of a shame since the game arguably had the best drift physics within Genki's own game collection. Plus, drifting around closed tracks for a change is interesting in its own right, but because you can only challenge rivals one by one, with some of them having their drift layout being as long as 2 full laps around tracks like Tsukuba, it ends up overextending its presence, taking up way more time than the other race types overall. It gets even more disappointing without the presence of This does make it into a bad mode to gather money. There's no increase in payouts compared to SP, but it is a good way to stockpile a lot of NP currency due to it taking in drift points as well. Now, what is NP? I'm not exactly 100% sure about this one, but it seems to be a point accumulated based on how well you're driving, anything from clean racing, constant high speed, and drifting, going down whenever you get into a collision and flying off track. So I think it's best to treat it like a driver rating system, especially since its main use is to gain access towards specific race days. Then we have RP battles, which essentially works like an official circuit race. Depending on the day, you could either challenge a full set of crew members or end up having random nameless racers or even wanderers join the race as well, with 6 racers on the grid. If you do get all crew members in, then this race mode immediately becomes the best method to progress quickly, causing the crew boss to be summoned after the race. However, due to the race itself being a long single event, the currency earn rate is pretty much just average. As a fully legal race, there are some new mechanics introduced, such as the penalty system. Normally 100 is the amount you get at every race start. For each violation, your score will be deducted. If it drops low enough, the game will summon the FIA to hit you with a 10-second stop and go penalty that you cannot refuse. Let it go to 0 and you're instantly disqualified for being an absolute menace. While the system itself is good for encouraging clean driving, it's not without its fair share of issues. For starters, usually we'll start at the back of the grid, making the early part of the races into a stressful time of dodging traffic. Plus, the game does not distinguish if a rival is at fault for hitting you, meaning every hit you take is automatically your fault. The Japanese bias is very prominent in this racing scene apparently. Either way, that won't stop us from dominating the scene. As we continue to rack up wins against crew members, their leader will show up for a duel. Uniquely, if said leader is challenged via SP race, the day will immediately start with a race starting from the pit lanes, putting you up against the leader without having to chase them down like the crew members. This is also applicable to any wanderers that may show up for a challenge. You can keep track of which rivals have been beaten by checking in the track selection screen, with the different colors to indicate each rival's status. If you ever feel slow, try pressing the select button. It'll hit you with a dose of turbo at the cost of increased temperature gain. Beat enough crew leaders and a so-called race master will show up. These guys are the bosses that block the path to progress, and they can be quite a handful to deal with. But once you beat them, the next stage will be open, unlocking more tracks to race on, higher classifications for both new and old tracks, and further unlocking more vehicles and upgrades to tinker with, which this game seems to handle real well by comparison to most Genki games, even the rear-wheel drive cars. As mentioned before, however, this game only features Japanese brands with no American or European cars in sight. Despite that, the game still boasts around 116 cars in total, ranging from your usual sedans, compacts, cake cars, and sports cars, including several boss cars and special cars based on real-life race cars, and that wouldn't stop Genki from bringing their goofy side out, especially with some of the Wanderers and boss cars. These are unlocked specifically from beating the respective opponents, and for the rest of the roster, you just have to make some progress, unlocking batches of new cars and upgrade parts along the way. As a side note, however, you can only store at most 3 cars at any time. Anything more, you'll have to either sell or move cars you don't use often into the sub-garage, which effectively puts it into hibernation. The tuning shop this time around still feels mostly familiar if you've played other Genki titles beforehand, but this time they've added a feature called the recommended tune, which immediately shows you any available direct upgrades for performance parts. It might make it easier to tune up your ride, but this feature also tends to ignore specific parts as a drawback. This option will not cover things like tires, however, which you may want to switch around depending on the weather and conditions. The options range from high grip, hard, medium, and soft, rims for cosmetics purposes and possibly weight management, aero options for those with a knack to rise up their cars, and finally dress-ups for extra visual customization. Unfortunately, Genki's livery editor still uses the old drawing method, which means you're gonna have to be extremely creative to make some decent liveries. Interestingly, this page also features the gauge options, which gives players more tools to help monitor the car's status during events, with the option to even customize the layout on screen for maximum information or just making things look cursed in general. The customization this time around did not hold back, carrying a lot of the features from TXR3, including a familiar engine swap feature, which has been made more accessible by simply achieving 25% completion. This makes progression with slower cars a lot more manageable, and because the game has both the DNA of TXR and the drift spin-offs, they went extra hard on the more silly aspects of customization. But then there's the option called Restore. The game features a form of damage and wear system, requiring you to spend money on fixes every now and then. There's no cosmetic signs of damage, but it will result in overall lower performance. If you've decided to buy a used car, this part will be very relevant, as it often turns out the previous owner was a pretty bad driver overall, and now you're stuck footing the repair bills.
Oh my god.
This is what balanced out used car dealerships. Despite the lower prices for pre-upgraded cars, it can end up being more expensive due to requiring immediate repairs. Every now and then you may receive an invite to special races, taking place on any available tracks for the usual race or time trial challenges, either with a preset vehicle or your own ride, often providing a large sum of cash. This makes special races somewhat irrelevant due to SP races existing, but sometimes they can end up giving extremely lucrative rewards. Like an early upgrade unlock, the special race themselves can be quite unique outside of this, as it is the only place featuring the oval track, used exclusively for drag racing. In addition, another new mechanic introduced for this title is the so-called driver item, which can be normally obtained via the Super Auto Bag shop, where you can check and buy any of the new items in stock. Once you have them, they can be used to decorate the garage via the layout option. While you can't really move them around like in other games such as Automodelista, it is nice to have more options to make your garage truly your own. But the true meat of this system lies in the car goods option. Here you can equip the items in 3 different sets, which seems to be intentional so players can set each set for the different racing disciplines. Some of the effects of these items can range to the weird and obscure mechanics, such as rival emotion.
What the fuck is this?
The more precise features of reducing SP damage taken, increasing drift points, or lessening penalties during RP races, with some of the more basic features of reducing tire wear, oil and water temperature buildup, increasing currency gain, morale boost. You get the idea. By default, you can equip at most 4 items, but on certain days, the Autoback shop may sell an item that can increase the maximum slot. They're not mandatory. In fact, you can't beat the game without bothering with them whatsoever for the vanilla experience, but they are pretty useful to counter the game's jank. If that's not enough, Super Autobacks also features a music shop containing tracks from both TXR3 and Kaido Racer 2. With this, you can set up a personalized track for menus and racing in the options menu, giving more options for players who may prefer songs from the prior games to this game's track. It is interesting to hear how close this game's soundtrack is to Wangan Midnight, but honestly it just fits really well. And there is an extra garage option if for some reason you feel like renovating, coming at a cost of 1 million CP. And Genki's biggest strength comes in clutch with the mailing system. Here you can get information such as which rival may pop up, certain wanderer requirements, the general tips for racing, just from reading the community's conversations. It generally helps with world building in some aspects, making you understand the demeanor of certain drivers while making the game world feel more alive without having to explicitly see any faces. They even added new features like the ability to read certain crews' group chats, allowing drivers' personality to shine and to see their chemistry between one another. With a total of 100-ish rivals in the mix, most being based or returning rivals from the mainline TXR titles and their own preset vehicles, which you can obtain whether by checking the custom and special page in the new car dealership, or by luck via the used car dealership. Each split into groups set to populate all 9 tracks between the 4 progression stages. The way tracks of this game are used is an interesting manner, and easily becomes the biggest factor to this game's strength and weaknesses, due to each track's composition and layout. It's not as simple as the mainline TXR, where most of the track would favor top speed setups, or the drift spin-offs that will prefer high acceleration for its tollgate tracks. Each stage not only increases the rival count, but also the amount of tracks available, with Stage 2 introducing Osaka Kanjo Highway Circuit, TI Circuit Aida, and Suzuka's Western layout. Stage 3 then brings in Suzuka's full layout, the Shutoko Inner Loop, and the Nikko Circuit, totaling a whopping 10 tracks in total, including the oval track for its drag races, making car setups for each situation and race discipline more rewarding, which has been made more accessible with auto setups for quick tuning, although the option to do it manually is still available as per usual, giving each track its distinct identity from one another based on their favorite tuning setups, and some may even shift later as they remain relevant with higher performance vehicles, as you'll have to beat the new crew members with the higher class tiers. Instead of simply beating one boss and progressing, the number of bosses required to beat increases proportionally to the corresponding stage. As a result, in Stage 2 you'll have to beat crews on all 6 tracks and 9 later on the 3rd stage. But this track progression setup comes at a cost. This gets exponentially worse, as unfortunately both DP and race battles would be hit by bad scaling and worsening rival distribution. DP races take multiple laps of a single track for completion for each individual rival, and RP races start to become equivalent to mini endurance events. If that's not bad enough, RP races get hit with RNG factors of randomized crew members even in the later stages, which also gets worse as wanderers start to spawn more often based on progression, taking away spots from regular crew members as they receive higher priority. It ends up hurting the game's overall pacing and mode balancing, turning SP races into the de facto best mode purely for the payout and quick-paced race duration. But even that's not exactly reliable, as which class gets its share of race type is determined by random numbers as well, making it harder to guarantee getting SP races for the higher classes. The only way to counter this is by using the skip function, right below the special race option. While this essentially makes this game contain as much content as possible, it comes at a heavy cost due to the difference in track layouts and how it's handled. In the mainline series, the only thing available is SP battles or the very rare sprint races. The drift spin-off has its fair share of game modes and multiple amounts of mountain tracks as well, but it's handled in a way where each rival can only be challenged in one race type of their choice, and they'll all have their own set layout for each track. This setup allows them to essentially stave off fatigue from racing on the same track over and over again, something C1 Grand Prix unfortunately does not have the luxury of, as most tracks in this game are essentially very short circuits, which leaves little room for personalized rival sections. This is the reason why Stage 3 will end up filling the majority of total playtime, with the amount of time spent on long races against triple the amount of rivals from Stage 1, which can be fun or unique for some players looking for endurance events in a Genki title, as they tend to only have quick races with minimal outlier, but I think this is not well thought out, mostly due to having not enough options and too many random factors in place. While I get it to mainly have a somewhat realistic vibe to an actual track day event, there could be ways to improve on this, like maybe a calendar system that tells you what race type and class tier each track would have on specific dates. That way, if a player prefers a race type and is aiming for specific class tiers, can just skip to those days specifically. And additionally, improvements on drift races could be made that immediately ends the race once the score goal has been surpassed, like in Kaido Racer 2 for example. And just generally generally better lap economy, alongside the ability to perhaps lock RP races only for crew members the first time around, cutting down on a lot of the bloat from both events, putting them close if not better than what SP races are currently in the game. Once all of that is done, however, there are a couple of things left to do. The final stage of RB-C1 GP itself is split into 3 different races against 15 bosses, each ruling over specific disciplines and being members of the Zodiac's crew from TXR0 and the remaining members of the 13 Devils. This is one of the few times when the tracks themselves became the equivalent of a battleground, as no other drivers are present in the SP battle portion, leaving only you and 5 bosses to defeat, individually or as a group. While nothing much changes from the drift race, the RP race meanwhile are the only ones where all 5 bosses are all challenged at once. Just don't underestimate these guys, as they can be quite dangerous, especially for the SP and RP races. But once you wipe the floor with these guys, it's time for the credits to roll in as we get to enjoy our 100% completion. Being a Genki title, it should be noted, the first credit is not going to be the true ending as is tradition with their games. Upon beating the members of the 13 Devils and the Zodiacs, the game's true 100% percentage is shown, revealing that we're pretty much only experienced around 50% of the game's content all along. This time, instead of simply noting how many rivals you've beaten once, the game shows you how many you've beaten in each discipline, with the true 100% requiring complete domination of each discipline on each track. But that is a story best left for you. There's way more new rivals introduced after this point. I'm not going to spoil the rest of the game for you. After spending over 20 hours on this game, I can certainly say this is one of the most interesting takes on the legal racing scene, mixing in ideas from Genki's usual take of street racing and adapting it into this closed environment, while also giving enough variety with the drift races and the official circuit races. But as I've already touched upon, the way this game has been balanced is its biggest weakness, making one race type into a clear superior option once reaching the end game. Despite these problems, the amount of improvement this game did over Genki's other titles is praiseworthy, making things like tuning and upgrading more approachable while making them less tedious with the recommended options, and the new features and quality of life improvements introduced into the game, like with the driver item, garage features, and used car dealership, are certainly welcome, although some like the special events definitely need a bit of tweaking. But overall, I'm glad this game finally got its chance to shine outside of Japan. So once again, big thanks to Igor for providing the translation. Playing this alongside the recent showcase from Genki's recent updates, it's getting me in the mood for TXR 2025. So here's hoping that game turns out well. But what about you? Have I piqued your interest in this title, or have you given it a shot yourself? If so, what are your thoughts about this game so far, and how excited are you for the upcoming TXR release? Let me know in the comments below, subscribe and like the video if you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.